Good morning once again. One of the elective courses that I took in seminary was titled God and Suffering. As I entered into this class for the first time, the professor announced that nearly 100% of our grade would be based upon a trial that we would hold and our performance in that trial. That trial was of God. Now, before all of you start to throw things at me or push me out the door, it was a fascinating class. It was a class in which we learned a lot about those questions that are imperious to most people. I want you to look into your hearts this morning and ask yourself one deep, very theological question. Have you ever asked the question, why me? I hope I'm not alone in asking that question. Because this is the question that we were after and we were chasing to answer in this course. Why, God, is this happening to me? And the answer to that question and how you got to that answer was what this class was designed for us to think through as seminarians. We were to answer the lifelong question nearly every person asks when they are in the midst of great turmoil. Why me, God? Why do I need to suffer this pain? Why do I have to suffer through these treatments? Why have you made this person or that person to suffer? Why can't I seem to get a break? Why do I never seem able to get ahead? And I'm hoping some of these questions feel familiar to you. I'm hoping they do, because I believe when we actually and actively seek out the answer to those questions, it's in those moments that our faith is deepened and strengthened, and we move just a little bit closer to God's true heart. Now stick with me on this. I think you'll see how these questions in that class and this morning can and should play out in our lives of faith today. So I want to take just a really quick second to go over this story once and again to kind of keep it fresh in our minds. So what we heard this morning is that 8 days after Jesus predicted his death for the very first time, at least according to the Gospel of Luke, he takes three people with him up onto a mountain to pray. He needs time to get away, to grow closer to God. And he takes Peter, James, and John, his three most trusted friends, with him. They go up on this mountain, and while they are there, Jesus is revealed to them in his greatest glory, his full glory of being God. And then these two individuals show up who happen to be Moses and Elijah, and they have a conversation with Jesus. Now, Peter, James, and John, in their unfortunate usual understanding, did not understand at all what was going on. They didn't grasp the full impact of what they had just witnessed. And then they come down the mountain stunned and bewildered. Sound about right? Is that what you heard? Yes? No? Okay, good. Just trying to make sure you're still awake. I think that covers what happens rather briefly, but as we go through this passage this morning, I want to look at a couple of different sections or pieces that I think hold a really powerful impact in our lives. And despite hearing this story year after year after year, there is something that we can take from it for us today. So one of the first things that comes to mind in this passage for me is this idea that Jesus needed time to pray. Do we not all need to get away and pray sometimes? I hope so. Prayer is such an important part of Jesus' life, and despite him being holy God and holy human, he needs to separate himself. He needs to pull himself away from the crowds that have gathered around him. This is something that's important for each of us today as well. I mean, how many of you over the last few years of separation, segregation, isolation, and pandemics have found yourself more and more isolated from others? Or maybe even more engrossed in the digital world that we find ourselves within, right? And when we can fall into those traps, I know I do on a daily basis, I call them rabbit holes, right? You get caught up in a story and it spins off to this story and then it goes to that story. And before I know it, I have spent an hour on the computer and I'm going, no, wait a minute, what was I going in here for again? I've begun to wonder how much of this, like the world at your fingertips, causes us to be separated from one another and less likely to engage in the things that really refill our spiritual tanks. I mean, when was the last time you went into a restaurant and sat and watched a family of four, like a parent, a child, two children, and the two parents, and they're sitting across the table from one another like this? I often wonder if they're texting one another. I mean, you don't see them talking, but they're doing something, right? And I've always been the kind of person that looks for space to be alone. I'm an introvert, whether you believe that or not. My wife will absolutely agree with me. I am an introvert. I need my spiritual tank to be refilled by myself when I'm in solitude. And one of the places that has always been a spot for me to find is somewhere outdoors. As a kid, I spent hours riding my bike up and down the street that I grew up on. When I got to be an adult, I learned how to hunt, and I became an archer. And I spent time, countless hours in tree stands. I didn't care if I shot at anything or not, or if I brought home a deer. I just was having space where I could connect and commune with God and be in the natural world. Although I will have to say, over the last 5 years, I've found myself less and less interested in being outdoors. And I also recognize that I'm not getting any younger. And so being outdoors holds less of an appeal to me. But at the same time, I'm always looking for new ways that I can fill my spiritual tank. You with me on this? Has anyone else experienced this kind of need towards finding the space to connect with God in new ways over the last couple of years? Okay, I'm seeing a couple heads do this. Good. In my mind, this piece in verse 28, which says Jesus took Peter, John, and James up on a mountain to pray, spills out specifically. All right, I need to slow down, take a deep breath. I'm excited about this. It spells out specifically what Jesus was intending to do with his disciples. He was teaching them. And he has just been surrounded, probably mobbed, by thousands of people who wanted to be healed and cleansed from their illness or their sins. People who wanted to just reach out and touch the hem of his robe because they knew he had something powerful to give them in that act. He is drained. He's not only just physically drained, he's mentally drained, he's spiritually drained. He cannot do anything else, and he needs some time to separate himself from everything that's going on around him. And so he seeks out a place of solitude to pray. And he's taking his three most trusted individuals, his three most trusted friends, to teach them what it means to be in God's presence. Now, for some of us, this idea of Jesus praying might be difficult. I mean, he is God, right? I mean, it's hard to kind of get this idea. No, wait a minute. Who's he praying to? But he is. He's praying to God because he's both God and human at the same time. But for me, it indicates how important it was for him to speak to God. I mean, think about that for a minute. Really think through what's happening here. He's praying to the one being in the world who already knows what he's thinking, already knows what's in his heart. Yet he has become humanly drained. So he seeks to be renewed and refreshed in God's presence. Does that speak to you about what we should be doing in this day and time as well? I hope it does. But the other piece that I want us to consider as well is it doesn't end there, because Luke goes on to tell us, and as he was praying, the appearance of his face was transformed. His clothes became dazzling white. Envision that in your minds for a moment. Consider what it might mean. He was praying and his appearance was changed. Peter, James, and John were witnesses to how the glory of God came upon Jesus. His appearance became what he truly was. Now, I can think of only one other person who was also able to witness the glory of God on a mountaintop, and that was Moses, who, by the way, was mentioned in this passage as well. While what he transformed into is important, it's not the most important piece. I want you to hear that Jesus was changed. He was transformed. He was made into his full glory, sparkling, dazzling glory. Now, Jesus isn't the only one who could be transformed, gang. We too can be transformed in our lives. But we need to be prepared to be transformed. Maybe the best word to understand is, if I dare say it, changed. Now, how many of you would agree with me when I say that's one of the hardest things to accept in this world? Okay. The thing is, we need to expect to be changed in our relationship with God. We need to expect to be transformed from the inside out. It's not necessarily an outward transformation that happens, but if we're brutally honest with ourselves and with each other, we should be prepared for something to be different about us when we start accepting responsibility for living as Christ taught us. Yes? This thing of transformation is a teaching moment for Christ. Luke tells us as Moses and Elijah were starting to leave, Peter, not even knowing what he was saying, blurted out, "Master, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let us make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while that's an important thing to him, it's not what Jesus was trying to get him to understand. And Peter doesn't quite understand his purpose for being there that day. But his purpose was to witness to the change in Christ. For him to fully grasp and understand that we need to accept change ourselves. Like most of us, I'm sure, it's hard to understand what's right before our eyes most times, not necessarily the deeper meaning. And so at this point, you might be asking yourselves, what exactly is the point of studying this, right? I've gone all different ways with this. And there's a couple of things. First and foremost, this is an affirmation for the disciples who witnessed this event, that is to recognize Jesus fully God, as shown in his physical appearance. The second is an affirmation that what Jesus was about to do in Jerusalem would forever change the world. Let me say it again. What Jesus was about to do would forever change the world, because he would soon leave and ascend into heaven, forever leaving a mark in the hearts of those who chose and choose to follow him. And finally, the most important piece to me is that we too can be claimed by God if we are open to the possibility that God chooses to use even us to make this world a better place. It's a lot. There's a lot in this passage. But as we begin to prepare ourselves to enter into Lent, I wonder if this story might be a call for us to allow a change to happen. I know, that's a hard word to hear, right? We don't like change. We like things to stay the way they are. Why can't it just be the way it always has been? Yeah, the world is changing way too fast around us for us to sit still. And that's the point. But as we enter into a time of fasting and prayer and lament, hopefully allowing ourselves to be transformed by Lent itself, this story stands as a reminder that we need to be and expect to be different at the end of it. Because if we're not, there's no hope for a change in this world. It has to start with each of us. And we can do it. Because I know you're all foolish enough to believe that you can. Amen.